So how long did it take for you to feel like your business had reached a level of stability?
I'd say 10 years, roughly, plus minus a little bit.
But that's a very realistic number, which is often overlooked.
Yeah, no, very clearly in the early years, you encounter cash flow problems because things don't happen in the time frame you had planned. And, that's part of. I think that was part of learning it. And had one had more advice or more knowledge in the business part of things, maybe one could have avoided some of those stressful nights. But I think projects are so slow.
Yeah.
When a building takes 3-4 years and you can do only so many at a time, I think it's reasonable to allow for something like this to become stable only after.
Good architecture, like any creative practice, is a product of the experiences of its creator. An architect's work is directly impacted by experiences, travel, inspiring people, difficult circumstances, and so much more. While these conversations are interesting in themselves, it's all the more interesting when you drop someone with different life experiences into a new environment. Which brings me to my guest today, architect Niels Schoenfelder of Mancini Enterprises. On Everything Comes Together, I'll be speaking with people in the broader photography, architecture, and design communities. Rather than only talking about their work, we will be talking about them, their personal journey, the challenges they overcame, and the most pivotal incidents in their lives that made them who they are today. So now, let's get to it. Niels grew up in Germany, was exposed to art and architecture at a young age, moved to India through an internship, stayed back and built a successful career over the past 20 years. All of this is common knowledge already. During this interview, we explore his early years in Europe, the realities of running an architectural practice in India, and we discuss the concept of experiencing architecture and creating an architectural experience. In the interest of maximum COVID safety, this interview was recorded in the garden of Niels' workspace outside Chennai. It was a lovely experience shooting this interview under the trees, but you may hear more ambient sounds than normal. I just wanted to let you know that the Everything Comes Together podcast has a new home online. At everythingcomestogether.com, you can watch full episodes to get the whole story, or you can watch a treasure trove of playlists. On these playlists, a variety of creators from across the country present their experiences and opinions on a set of topics to give you a complete understanding of the work you love. Find out more at everythingcomestogether.com.
I grew up in the northern parts of Germany and near a town called Hanover. And there was largely uneventful sort of suburban situation. But we did have a nice exposure being close to the city to a varied array of cultural events, exhibitions, museums, concerts, and the like. So that's a nice thing in those parts, is that even smaller cities, what you would call tier 2 cities in India, or tier 3 cities, still have a decent amount of attention and funding for the arts and the cultures. So that was very enjoyable that way.
And did you get a chance to travel around and experience that art?
Yeah, so city would be 20 minutes away. You could easily go and hop and see an exhibition. You could attend concerts, things like that. It's a very natural part of your everyday life. Also because it was very accessible to everybody, students, school kids, everybody was sort of enticed to make use of it by very fair pricing and things like that. There was a very low barrier to all of that.
Yeah. And so how did the cities manage to do so many public exhibitions, were they publicly funded or are they all privately funded?
You have
It's
both.
not that common to see that, at least in this part of the world, right?
Well, I don't think it's fair to compare because the setups and the demographics are obviously completely different.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a mix of private and mostly public funded activity, and that seems to even today still bear fruit for the creative professions in general. Not just architecture or artists, but graphic design, typography. Most often, these institutions or events would be actually commissioning graphic design typography, and would be a very good client to the private ecosystem of the creative arts. Yeah.
Right. So, as you were going, you said you were near Hanover, which is closer to Hamburg.
2 hours south of
2
Hamburg.
hours away. So, what was the sort of topography around that area where you grew up? Was it hilly? Was it mountainous?
No, slightly hilly, sort of. This was the line where the glaciers of the Ice Age stopped,
Okay.
coming down from north. So at the end you have the soil which the glaciers pushed, that formed our sort of little forest and hills like that.
So it's like a craggy sort of.
Not craggy, just soft hills like that, forests. Yeah.
So I'm asking you that because that would also have influenced the type of architecture you would see in the area, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the local and the vernacular in that area are in the rural setting still perceivable. Cities, of course, have been changed massively by the two wars, or the Second World War, most of it. And so you have a very young-looking city with beautiful examples of the 50s, 60s architecture. And only little is left of the pre-war architecture. So, yeah. But it's still, interesting conservation efforts. Adaptive reuse is a very common sort of project type you would go and appreciate.
When you were young, were you able to appreciate this kind of architecture? Were you able to appreciate the art which was happening around you? Is that something that you were taught at a young age? Was that something you were exposed to in school?
Yeah, to some extent, obviously basics of it and to the limits of age. But I think it was a natural part to be, for more or less everybody, to be exposed to some of that. So art class in school would include some basics of architectural understanding, some basics of graphic design, art history, things like that. And of course, the environment, travel. It's normal to, in your vacations, to go and see, it used to be normal for us to go and see archaeological sites, nice examples of architecture all over Europe, or, wherever we could travel.
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting to see that you're exposed to that at a young age, and it almost seems natural that somebody who is exposed to the right things when it comes to art and architecture, they sort of are able to translate that little bit easily once they grow older, is at least what... So I grew up in a creative household, right? So my granddad, my dad and my mom, all of them had their own various forms of creative process. So that's where I'm trying to draw parallel between, the environment that you grew up in. Did you have people in your family as well who were in a similar line to what you're doing now?
A little bit. My grandmother had studied what you would call here commercial graphic art, like graphic design really in the 20s.
Yeah.
Her father, my great-grandfather, was a sort of building master, you would call it, a sort of contractor with the ability of planning and engineering rolled into one person. Of course, I never met him. But yeah, a little bit like that. And I think you're right. I mean, when it starts at a young age that this is a normal or a given in your everyday life, then it has a value just like other professions or other occupations also have. It doesn't stand apart.
Yeah.
And you don't have to sort of, question yourself or society around, is this of equal importance or not? It just naturally is equally important.
Yeah, there's no questioning anything. So the decision is, it's the same. It's whether you do one line of work or you do another line of work. All of it is as natural. So, and is that how it progressed for you as well to move into architecture, or were you interested in something else growing up?
Yeah, I mean, school was, say, manageable. And then towards the end, though, it became very interesting in physics and mathematics. I had excellent teachers, and that was really lucky.
Okay.
So I was hesitating, should I go in that more scientific direction? But then last minute, in a way, I decided to study architecture. Maybe also because there was no fear of doing the wrong thing. At that time, it was still normal that you go into university, you do a semester or two, you figure it out, and if it's not for you, you change. And that was not frowned upon, or there was no problem with that. So in that sense, there was a nice freedom to say,
and
okay.
that's once you get into college.
That's once you get into university, yeah.
University, yeah.
So it's university, and therefore, from the beginning, it's a little bit more free. The course structure is not really as strict as college in its schedule and its curriculum. And it gives you, therefore, the options early on to say, hey, I'm going to try this out this semester, next semester I'm going to do that one, but let's skip this one. And so you get to discover on your own terms.
So I, early on in the season of the podcast, I spoke to 3 architects from Chennai. Well, 2 from Chennai and another one also from India, all of whom studied right now actually in Europe doing their masters. And all of them are studying through the pandemic. So that was the conversation. And they were talking about how, especially the architect who's studying in Germany was talking about how you can switch or take whichever course you want at different times. So I assume that's what you're referring to, where if you like a course from a different department, you're free to do that.
In fact, you're encouraged to also go and see beyond architecture in the larger university ecosystem. What does interest you?
Yeah.
And you could easily come back to your professors and say, hey, this course of in musical history interests me. Can I do this semester? Can you give me some credits for it? And it would be an open discussion like that, and you could, more often than not, really build your own curriculum to your interests, including traveling during the semester, saying that I'm going to go to this town or that town, study a particular architectural configuration or an urbanistic project, and come back and present it to you, and that will count as my attending that particular semester.
Yeah.
So there was that kind of flexibility, which was, I think, very inspiring for many of us.
But that also, I think, makes you a little bit more of a well-rounded individual if you are allowed to roam free and explore whatever you want to explore. After school, when you were going to university, you studied at the University of Darmstadt.
That's right.
And so I've obviously heard of that university because it seems to have had a huge number of really notable alumni from science and a whole bunch of Nobel laureates, if I'm right.
Oh, is that so? Right. Could be.
So, no, but what is it about a certain university or college or a school that, is able to churn out people who are able to consistently excel over the generations almost? They must be doing something different, right? So what was your experience like there? Was this particular university doing something different to help you grow? Because it's sort of like giving you the right atmosphere to study in, right?
Sure. Well, I think there's a general explanation to this is that the universities are, of course, all publicly funded in Germany, very few exceptions, and but the mandate lies with the state to fund these universities, and it is common rule that these universities and their professors have the liberty to decide their curriculum without seeking approval whatsoever from the state or from the ministry.
Yeah.
So this is a very open system. So the university therefore feels the pressure when they have to replace a professor, when somebody retires and they have to find somebody new. There's a very interesting process of finding the right person for your university team who would fit in and re-energize or turn into a different direction the entire overall ecosystem. And that's interesting that way. And I think that inspires students to think of their topics in a similar way.
Yeah.
That this is self-motivated, it's driven by your capabilities and interests. And I think it has a trickle-down effect. And I do think it works in certain sized universities. I think sometimes when I look at smaller colleges, I do feel there's a problem of scale as well. When the college becomes too small, while there are undeniably great advantages of having closer contact with your teachers, but I do think then there is a certain, call it cosmopolitan aspect to the place and to the group of people which then lacks. And I think that's, at least for me, that was super important.
Right. And so was your university on a smaller scale, or was it a larger space?
The university as a whole, I think, is a reasonable average size in Germany. You call these towns university towns because the population knows, or the society of town knows that...
Sustained by the university.
Sustained by the students. When there are 10, 20,000 students in one city, then they have, they take part in public life and in commercial life as well.
Yeah.
So, exhibitions, restaurants, pubs, all of that thrives on the young population.
Right. And what was your experience at university? Did you enjoy it? I mean, school obviously wasn't that great an experience, right?
School wasn't, no, it wasn't bad, but not to be compared with university. It was a very great course to study. I think it's one of the most interesting courses, I feel, because you really get to do so many different things. It's not just a cerebral part of engineering mathematics, but you also work with your hands. You do sculpture, you do drawings, you do painting, you travel, you have to travel. And that all of that put together was very inspiring for us.
So when, since you said it was a last minute decision to move from physics and mathematics to architecture, did you feel like you had some background to fall back on in terms of like sketching and understanding proportions and space and things like that? Yes, no?
I think, there come into play more your silent background of those many years of being exposed a little bit here and there, growing over the years like that to some of these aspects, be it in travel or be it in school. But I don't think the mathematical aspect had anything to do with it.
Yeah.
I don't think the sciences were that foundational for this particular course.
Right.
I mean, you needed them,
Yeah.
For the structural design courses and things like that.
Yeah.
But the overall understanding of space, proportion, and the sensibilities, I think, lie more maybe in the world of art than in the world of engineering. I don't know, maybe.
But it's sort of like a mix, right? So architecture, so as someone who is not an architect and is looking at it from the outside in, it seems to me like there is a healthy amount of engineering and art and understanding the the area around the building as well. So every one of your interests that's given to you because of the way the system is set up, and also the way that the way you absorb what's around you, it sort of really helps you put that together when you do architecture.
Yeah, I think not to be underestimated is also the manual part. That's not about engineering. It's more about commonsensical and physical experience with building something.
Yeah.
So as part of that particular university course, we were required to go and work actually with the building crafts, I think for 4 months or so. And so you become an intern I was an intern in a carpentry workshop for buildings. So you get to, you have to sweep the workshop and you have to carry the heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But you get to know how a construction site works, and you get to know the practicalities and the culture of building really a little bit, which I think is not to be underestimated in that mix of engineering, art, and let's call it craft for a lack of a better common name for it, commonsensical sort of building feeling for building.
Yeah, but that really gives you you're not leaving your architecture course only knowing how to design a building. You understand the practicalities, and that makes a big difference when you're out in the real world.
Some of it, obviously, you don't.
It's a taste.
Yeah. Some of it, yeah. You have an inkling.
You just mentioned the internship that you did at a carpentry studio, or
it's like a proper company, a building construction company, providing like roof structures and staircases and things like that in wood.
Yeah. So where else did you intern while you were at university?
So we had that internship, and then I went at some point to France to do some internships there. To also get a different perspective on the profession and try to learn a bit more of the language, things like that. And that brought me first to the south of France and then eventually to Paris. And that's also where I met my then boss, who had connections with Pondicherry, Eric Lo Cicero. And in fact, it's via him that I ended up in India for an internship to work here for 2-3 months. And I was supposed to go back to Paris, but I never did. Stayed back.
So what made you want to... It's a pretty big switch, right? So what made you want to do that?
Yeah, maybe you're young adventurers and it's exciting to just see different cultures and then see them also professionally, not just travel around as the free bird and not being involved. But when you do construction, you're very involved.
Yeah.
And then you sort of immerse yourself in a local culture very quickly and get to know about it and meet people you wouldn't be meeting as a tourist. And that was just highly fascinating. And it's maybe one of the richest countries in the world in terms of culture and heritage, and all that put together made me stay.
Absolutely. What was like your first impression, when you came here? What was that experience like? Because I suppose if you started off the process by coming here to design and then build, this was a hotel in Pondicherry.
That's right.
So you would have at least had some lead-in time. I assume that if you were coming here as an intern, you would have come in and straight away gotten down to the construction work as well. Or
that's right, yes. I mean, the basic drawings were done. The design idea was done, but none of the details were really figured out. And so that's what I did.
So
come here, figure the details. Yeah, exactly. Hit the ground running and learn as you go along, learn to communicate with local workforce and every other stakeholders, engineers. Yeah, it was fascinating.
And what was that? How did that project turn out? What kind of a building was it?
It was a heritage building in what they call the White Town in Pondicherry. And it used to be the mayor's house of Pondicherry. And the investors who became good friends had a plan to turn it into a small hotel. Okay. And that's what we did. It was extended on top by some very beautiful woodwork, heritage woodwork from Duplex's house, the French governor Duplex in the 18th, 19th century. And so the hotel was called the Duplex because of that. And that was a sort of the right product in the right size for somebody who would come in and discover very much manageable, not too big, but also very challenging in detail and quality. And so it was a beautiful way of starting to work in India. Yeah.
But was the other architect whom you were interning under, were they here as well at that time?
We came together, and he stayed a week or 2 or 3, I don't remember. And then from there on, we took it on and finished it it took 2 years then to do it.
Yeah. So you have your own, you obviously have a practice that's doing well here, and you must be getting people who want to intern with you, right?
We do.
So is there one is there anything that you would tell any intern or any young architect joining up somewhere? What should they be looking for? It's not about just one thing, right? It's what do you take away from an internship? What do you take away from even like an early job, one of the early jobs that you do?
Well, I think in the first couple of years, really, it should be about trying to figure out what kind of architectural environment is the right environment for you. Because there's so many different valid architectural studios out there, so many kinds of projects, right? If you get involved in big and heavy infrastructure, you work in a completely different world compared to, let's say, small residential jobs, where it's a much more shielded and private and domestic world, where you have a couple of team members, whereas in bigger buildings, infrastructure, you have hundreds of people involved in one project, and so that is really extremely different as a work environment. I think it's good to be honest with oneself and try to get internships in different environments to see these differences and figure it out what works for oneself.
Yeah, get different experiences and then see what you really
exactly.
like. Okay, coming back to your journey now. So at this point, you have made the move from Germany or through France to India. And how old were you when you did that?
I was 25, I think.
And how did your family react?
My family was okay. I mean, they had already an inkling that I wouldn't be, staying too close to home. I think they were somewhat expecting it.
It's quite different when you move halfway around the world. It's
yeah, but we are all travelers in the family, enjoying that part, and so I think it was a given that I would be moving around a little bit to, for that reason, to really initially enjoy the different cultures and the adventure of that.
Okay, so after you're done with your internship and the hotel that you guys were working on got ready and you stayed back in India, what happens next? Do you start working here on your own? Do you travel around?
Yeah, I traveled around while I was doing that, of course, all of South India. It's fantastic how you can get around in a public bus for close to, nothing, and you see and meet the most interesting people. So I did that, and there was enough work around there because obviously I'd met people, and the investor in the project, Dimitri Klein in Pondicherry, had more work, so I started with that. And then it was very gradually, slowly hiring one person, another person, and building a little studio like that.
Yeah. So, and I assume you worked with partners while you were here.
Yes.
So what was it like partnering with people for the first time?
That too came naturally, really. I met my partner, in fact, on the first construction site. He was working for one of the suppliers at that time, and then later we partnered. And I think it's a profession where you can easily figure out what works between different personalities, because you have this common language of drawings, and you always have something to focus around. It's not about emails or corporate abilities. It's about designing, getting a beautiful job done, and being extremely practical, really. It's an applied art, right? And it's really applied. It's at the forefront. And so that came very natural to us, and we have never had any regrets that way.
So anyone who's starting a business, and especially a creative business, when you don't have a huge deal of experience under you, finding work is the hardest part, right? Or finding work that you really enjoy. So how did you go about doing that, you and your partners? How did you go about finding interesting projects to work on, or were they more bread and butter projects to start off?
I think we had luck, of course. But you also have the opportunity to turn a bread and butter job into something really interesting, especially in this area of work, because the rules are not written in stone, or the expectations, let's say, of clients or investors are not 100% fixed all the time. You can bring your ideas to the table and say, hey, why don't we do it this way or that way? And start a conversation, engage with those who invest in architecture and see what your role can be, and sort of mold your role a little bit to the project, and vice versa.
Right.
And that's maybe one advantage of practicing in India, is that you still have this flexibility. It's not as flexible in Europe because you have much older structures, much more preconceived notions, and much more legal framework as well, which makes it a little bit harder to do.
But did you like that freedom when you came here?
Yeah, I think it's enjoyable. You need to. It demands a lot of self-motivation to make the best of it.
Yeah.
But it's certainly enjoyable. Yeah.
Is it hard to stay motivated?
No.
Or was it hard to stay motivated for you?
I'm sure it's the same for you. I mean, you get to define a shoot, I imagine.
Yeah.
You get to define the outcome of your work with the clients as much as architects get to do it with their clients.
Sure. But, for me at least, when I was starting off, when I started working, I was 19. And I probably looked 16. So the biggest problem was when I would meet potential clients and they were very concerned by what how old I was or whether I had that level of experience. And that was a problem. So the kind of work that I was getting early on was very basic, very rudimentary, mainly only, simple interior projects where I didn't get much freedom to do what I wanted. I didn't get much time to shoot. Right. So it was hard to stay a bit motivated by that. That's why I was asking you, because some of the other architects that I've spoken to have said that when they were starting off as well, they weren't getting really exciting projects to work on.
I think we had a mix of projects, and certainly there were those who you call bread and butter.
Yeah.
But because it's not difficult to get things done, even in those ones you learn.
Yeah.
You learn, they add up to experience.
Yeah.
Slowly over the years, and that way they have their place in your portfolio.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that there are no low points. There are, when it hits you, and that budgets may not be as you had imagined, or whatever it may, delays may not pan out, or you did not get as much time as you wanted for the design. But still, I do think it's part of the applied part of arts, right? Yeah.
So once you start finding work to start off, and you need to obviously find more in order to grow, how did you guys start getting more work going? So, and this was, you started Mancini, which is what we're talking about now, in 2004, and at that time I guess most people weren't online and there was no Instagram, which I think we can talk briefly about after this. But how did you go about trying to get new work? What's the first step?
For us, it really came from word of mouth, and it still does today. So there was at some point we had a website, of course, a small one, and still have a small one only. But it seems that when you do even small work, small jobs, interiors, whatever it is, and you do them with honesty and you do them to the best of your capacities, then people take note, and you will get one more phone call or two more phone calls, and not everything converts into, of course, the next project, but in essence, the word is out there, and we grew very, very, very slowly. There was no
There was no
moment
huge break that propelled you
no,
forward.
it was really, really very gradually, and I think it's natural to our profession because it's such a slow profession. Every project does take a fair amount of time, and it's mostly longer than what clients think in the beginning. And
But that slow growth also seems more sustainable. Do you feel?
yeah, I do think it has to. Patience is required for it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it appears a little bit frustrating, but I do think it's a sort of prudent profession or a conservative profession in a way that you cannot but actually handle on clients' behalf a lot of money. Buildings cost a lot of money, and therefore clients tend to be caught between those two poles. I'm spending all this money, I want to be careful with it. I want to make sure it's the right thing. And that is a natural instinct to say that how can I make sure my investment in this building is safe enough?
Yeah.
On the other hand, the client also would like that investment to yield the change in their lives, be it personal or be it professional, in a new office building or a new home.
Yeah.
They would like it to yield some sort of change. And that requires creativity and that requires uncertainty. And so those are the two poles and the architects between.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of balance that. And that just takes a lot of time. And when that gets exposed now to the fact that a large chunk of our construction industry is unorganized, then you have a lot of moving parts. And for that puzzle of moving parts, you just need patience. I think so.
The minute something moves slow, as a business, I mean, but were you comfortable with that rate of growth, or were you hoping that things would move faster? I can tell you why I'm asking you this question. There are a lot of people who, for various reasons, either financial considerations or their own level of patience, right? They want quick growth. They want to make a good amount of money very quickly, which is obviously everyone wants that. But were you comfortable with that level of growth? Were you expecting something else?
I frankly didn't know what to expect. My upbringing was not in a family of business people, so I did not really have any background in the business aspect of it. And so maybe I just was naive enough not to know what to expect, and therefore we were so engrossed in the content of our work, in the day-to-day activities, that we rarely took the step back to say, are we growing fast enough or not? Was never the question, really.
Right.
It went on, and it happened to be an upward trend, a slow one, but an upward trend, and so we were happy with that.
Yeah. Now, after speaking to you a few years ago, it was very clear to me that you're a good photographer and you're passionate about it. And was that something that helped, having the quality of images available to you?
I think the quality of images of your work is extremely important, and maybe becomes only more important with social media and things like that. I'm by no means a professional photographer, but I have knowledge of the basics. I did have my own dark room and in my youth, and did develop film and prints myself. And so, yeah, sure, I do think it helped me to frame some of the work in simple and straightforward ways and communicate, therefore, what we were able to do.
Yeah.
I think it's very important to spend energy and time on it. And there are many ways of doing it. Doesn't have to be always self-initiated. You can also hire professionals, but it certainly plays a big role in, at the very least, to document your work and have archives.
Yeah. So where did you pick up photography? Is that something just you picked up along the way in school, or at university or?
Yeah, no, it's for school. As a school kid, my mother was was doing photography as a hobby, really.
Yeah.
And so I just came to it like that. And then we got this little dark room and started experimenting, and that is fascinating, a fascinating thing to do. Spending your nights.
And it's endless, right? There's always something new that you can try and.
Yeah, and so it's really creative because you have everything is in your fingers, and then the chemicals, and you adjust a little bit, and the entire image changes. So it's more engaging, I feel, than digital because there is a physical feedback to it.
Do you still shoot film?
No, unfortunately not. I would love to, but there's no time for it.
Do you still shoot your projects?
Yeah.
Most of them?
Many of them.
Yeah. And how do you feel your approach to the photography? As an architectural photographer, I'm curious, has your approach to shooting your own spaces, your own buildings, has it changed from earlier to now?
A little bit. I won't say drastically. I think I default to the basics to say, okay, let's first get the main axis done, the facades and whether it's inside or outside the room, main axis or the project main axis, and then try to look a little bit at the diagonal vistas. But maybe now we are trying to be a little bit less wide and try to avoid the very wide lenses a little bit and try to get a bit more depth by restricting the frame, but
more details
a little bit more details. But we're not professionals, so we're just going about it
But that's interesting, right? I mean, everyone shooting architecture from the perspective of the person who designed the space is different from shooting architecture as a photographer itself.
Yeah, I don't think it's the best thing to do, actually, because you're so married to the way you've drawn it. And now that everything's also in 3D models, our 3D team has also a very sort of clear understanding of volumes and proportions and even the camera angles, because they also have cameras in their software and they render it in particular frames. So, and often now, in fact, our head of 3D, Hari, is often shooting now. So he sometimes goes and recreates exactly his renderings when the project is done, which is a nice thing to compare the rendered and the actual. But I think it's actually missing to have a photographer's eye come to the process and question a little bit the convictions of the architects who think that it should be looked at only like that.
Yeah.
So that's missing a little bit.
So let's get back to talking about your work, right? And there's just one thing when it comes to the business that I want to ask you about. We talked about this, and I think it's something really important to discuss, which is how long, you said it's slow progress, right? So how long did it take for you to feel like your business had reached a level of stability?
I'd say 10 years, roughly, plus minus a little bit.
But that's a very realistic number, which is often overlooked.
Yeah, no, very clearly in the early years, you encounter cash flow problems because things don't happen in the time frame you had planned, and that's part of. I think that was part of learning it. And had one had more advice or more knowledge in the business part of things, maybe one could have avoided some of those stressful nights. But I think projects are so slow. When a building takes 3-4 years and you can do only so many at a time, I think it's reasonable to allow for something like this to become stable only after.
And I think that also calls for a level of patience patience and tempered expectations, right? And I think that at least I feel that having those expectations, more realistic expectations about rate of growth sort of helps you stay calmer, that allows you to probably do better work because you're not constantly worried about, you know, how much of a profit you're making year upon year.
Yeah. No, I think it's important. It's important that you don't lose the focus on the actual topic, which is the design and the quality of all of that, over concerns from the business side of it. It just never pays back. If you start cutting corners because you want to go faster, I don't think that's viable in the long run.
I've read a few interviews that you've done over the years, and one thing that you talk about is that you've always had a variety of projects to work on. So just very briefly, could you tell me what are the kind of projects that you work on a day-to-day here?
Yeah, it's still a very wide variety. It's from, of course, private commissions, houses, gardens, things like that, interiors for houses, private interiors, as well as office buildings. We have done a little bit of, in collaboration with good friends from Oroville, done a bit of landscape projects focused around eco-restoration.
Yeah.
Larger projects, 60, 70 acres. We have done a little bit of public building.
Yeah.
And we do that all over India and abroad as well. Right now we have 2 projects in the US where we do, again, different things, landscape and residential. And at times we do work for developers, commercial buildings as well.
So how do you manage the projects which happen outside India? Do you have people, do you take a local architect, work with them?
No, in this case we haven't. There's a very good contracting team who are very well set up, and they themselves, in fact, employ architects in-house. And so that works very well.
Okay. So where I was getting at is, so with all this diverse set of projects that you work on, do you feel like there's one connecting thread between them in your approach or in the style of projects that you, the style of work that you do? Is there something that you feel is like a connecting thread between the varied typographies?
I don't know if we always succeed, but the desire, of course, is to find what is important for that particular project and to put the finger on that. And it's not just on the surface. You have to try and dig down a little bit and see what really would make the biggest difference to the task at hand.
Experiencing architecture or the experience within any building or any space is an intangible thing. As let's say, I'm not talking about from the architect's point of view, I'm talking about from anyone visiting a space. You can't always put a finger on what you feel when you're going through a certain space, right? It's about the mood, it's about the materials, and it's how you design the space that gives that mood to the person walking through it. Do you deliberately try to imbue certain qualities into your architecture? Is it something that you like to go for?
Yeah, sure. You have to have goals to know how to design, right?
So how do you realize those goals from an intangible thing to a physical object?
Well, that's where we try to bring to fruition, in a way, our experiences as physical beings, right? And our experiences as professionals with knowledge about the rules of the art, if you can call it like that.
Yeah.
And you combine that, the rules of the art or theory or things you would have learned formally, with the things you learn informally by just being a perceptive human using space.
Yeah.
And we all have that, right? If you go to a restaurant, you will know in a fraction of a second which table you ideally would like to sit on.
Yeah.
In that given space.
Very instinctive.
It's very instinctive and has something to do with our bodies and the way we behave in public when others are around. Yeah. And that's, I'm sure there's some sort of primordial instincts play into that. Yeah. But I do think that the architecture happens when you combine it.
Yes, exactly.
Combine that part with the learned part of of proportion, of art, of history of art, history of architecture, archaeology, engineering, and all of that plays into it. And so I think that gives you somewhat like a toolbox where you know that if the emotions or the reactions you would like to favor, I don't think you can provoke them for sure. You can't be sure about it, but you could favor certain reactions in the user. Then you know that you have to do it this way or that way. Right. The height, or the space, the amount of space, the proportion of how much is left next to my shoulder when I pass through a passage.
Yes.
It's all. It all is very mundane. It's all inches and centimeters, and this material, that material doesn't sound very poetic. But when it's all put together, it better be.
And that's the same for photographing architecture as well. So when I teach workshops, it's a lot about looking at what time of year it is, so you know exactly where the sun is going to be and how long are the shadows going to be, what's the color of the sunlight going to be at that point of time. And also, like when you stand in a certain place, how much of your field is going to be in focus. There's so many things. It's sort of is like, it's sometimes like watching these behind the scenes clips of how movies are made with great special effects. You suddenly see there is a process to it, and well, that it sort of takes the magic out, but the magic is actually that process in itself.
I think it's a very good analogy. The movies, I often think about it a little bit like a soundtrack in a movie, in fact. Right? The architecture we experience most of the time really is background, isn't it? You may be good at your job, you may have a family problem, you may have a family celebration, whatever it is, and the architecture melts in the background, but it's there. And it influences just in small ways what's happening. And then now and then it kind of jumps into the foreground a little bit when you start noticing it or does something good to you, just like you may recognize a song in a movie, or so the soundtrack, which is noises and a soundscape really. But the soundtrack also is music and composition, so it's a little bit like that. And I enjoy that, to be able to say, no, we are going to stay in the background here. For this project, we're not going to bring out the big fireworks. We are going to riff on the vernacular, or that way we're going to stay in the background and let life have its space. And sometimes you need to bring it all out, the fireworks. I'm sure that's a similar thing for you. Sometimes you go after a big shot.
I never thought of it as music, but when you so I listen to a lot of podcasts, and a lot of these conversational style of podcasts like what we're doing now, they have a very soft, neutral music playing in the background. And what's interesting is I've noticed that they use the soft, neutral music when the guest is talking about something that's really happy. And they use the same soft, neutral music when they're talking about a very somber time in their lives. Or they use the same thing when they're talking about how their business just crashed and burned, right? But because it's so neutral, it sort of takes on the flavor of the conversation, and the music suddenly, the same neutral music, becomes somber, becomes cheerful, becomes inspirational. And I think that's, so when you talk about architecture being like the soundtrack, it's like, whether you're going through happy times or sad times, or jubilant times, great success or failure, you're probably going to be living in the same house, and the house takes on whatever your mood is, right? It's almost like that's almost tangible when you walk into a room that's happy or sad. You feel it. And I think that also has a lot to do with the quality of light within the space. So how do you, what is your approach to quality of light? Because the reason at the beginning of the interview I asked you about, what kind of a place was where you grew up, because the quality of light, natural light there, is really different from how it is here. How do you try and bring in that? Because I've noticed that in the interiors of your buildings, there is a very soft white quality of light, which is quite different from a lot of places that you go to, right? Larger, more horizontal windows, longer windows where there's more light coming in, but it seems a bit more diffused. Obviously, that is intentional. So, what's your approach to lighting a space?
It's interesting what you say. I'm not sure if it comes from, but maybe it does come from the, your experience of different light conditions in different parts of the world. I often think that, at least here in South India or many parts in India, we often have too much light. And if you move the window out and let it receive direct sunlight, and it's a big window because you may want views or whatever it is, you just generate such a high contrast between your internal surfaces and the bright window that everything burns out. And I often feel one wants to get a little depth to the opening so that the transition is not as contrasted, not as stark, not as harsh on the eye. And so, how do you shade it? The landscape plays a huge role. A tree can do that job, nicely placed. And so it is important to us. I think it's one of the big prime concerns we have is the light, natural and artificial. So pretty much like in your field, the light really, a project well lit is, and of mediocre quality itself is still better than a great project badly lit. So
what I really like to, so there are times when I'll get to see buildings when they're under construction. So they don't have the window frames, they don't have the blinds, they don't have curtains, they don't have anything inside them. And I find the quality of light there sometimes is better than when everything is in place. When you have no obstruction and no filtration of the light coming in. I mean, that's what. Yeah,
it's complex, huge topic, and it's fascinating. Sometimes there are lighting designers involved, which is also very interesting because they have a complete different take on it. It's mostly more technology driven, and that's interesting too. But even the basic architectural moves of, shading devices, fabrics, I think, are often undervalued in that context. For us, often the fabric has more structural, really, qualities than decorative.
In what way?
In the way that it does change the light so fundamentally. So when we look at a fabric, it's not about its decorative qualities, its pattern or color in the first place, but how will it change the room altogether by virtue of filtering the light. And so the weave and the thickness and becomes a lot more important.
When I look at a movie, I think of it as shots and lighting as well, which is obviously related to what I do. It's very interesting to. I mean, I'm quite interested to know what's that like to watch a movie where there is, let's say, a home or an office, which may very well just be a set,
sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But are there times when you look at one of those sets and you think that there's no way that can actually happen?
Well, that's the poetic license, isn't it? I mean, of the movie makers, and that's often inspiring when you have those sets which are just fantastic because they support the spirit of the movie. They don't have to be realistic, but they have to support the spirit of the movie, right? And so that's very inspiring. But it's equally good to watch a movie and not to notice the sets in particular, which means that the movie also works because it just draws you into the story, whatever has been displayed, and it doesn't let your architect's mind come and interfere. So I enjoy both moments. Of course, there are movies where you say, wow, that's a great set, and you even look up who designed it, or in theater as well, even more so because it's more abstract and the means are more restricted on a theater stage. but it's hugely inspiring. The lighting, again, it comes back to that. With how so little worlds can be created on a little stage like that. And it's believable because it's poetically right. It's not realistic, but I had a client once, still a client today, who came and wanted an interior done for an apartment in the city. And we'd ask him, okay, what do you enjoy? What's your inspiration? Is there anything you can refer to which you think may be relevant for us to know about? And he came with the movie set. He said a particular movie, it had Al Pacino in it, and the apartment of the protagonist, the character Al Pacino was playing, that was his inspiration. And it was an apartment where you could turn around. You were like from the kitchen to the living to the dining, back to the kitchen. And somehow the client enjoyed that. And that was a great help because then you have an immediate starting point for you to start designing and getting all kinds of wild ideas. Works very well.
Yeah, and it's also great when you have that freedom to do, when you're given one interesting brief and then you have the freedom to go and
then you react to it, and then make it yourself. Yeah.
We talked about this in the pre-interview as well, that your wife is a partner at Vastrakala, which is, they do some fabulous work that I've really enjoyed seeing in embroidery and textiles and fabrics, and you touched upon fabrics a little bit earlier. So that must mean that the environment at home itself is a creative, an atmosphere where creativity is allowed to foster. How does being around someone who has a different type of creativity, how does that bounce off you, and how do you bounce off her creativity, and how does that help being around creative people all the time?
Well,
do you feel like that has influenced the way you look at things?
Possibly. It certainly helps you change perspectives, right? Because there's somebody whom you trust, whose perspective is available to you. And we share, of course, inspiration books and all of that is interesting from the, say, decorative arts and the history of that. And then there is the architectural angle to it. Right. So when we do get time to travel and look at things like that, that's highly inspiring to compare viewpoints and, certainly very, very pleasurable to have that. Yeah. But then, of course, there is an everyday life where we don't have always time to, there's not always time to delve into the depth of that. But even then, it's good to have somebody who can understand even the aspects of running a creative business and things like that. Yeah. Certainly helps in a daily routine as well.
Yeah, and it sort of gets internalized after a certain point, right? Where you start to understand another creative person's perspective. So you look at your own work through their eyes almost. And that may help you,
exactly.
do your own thing differently.
Correct. Yeah.
So it really helps to have, even if it's not someone you live with, but creative peers, creative partners, collaborators. That's something to be encouraged, I would say.
Very important. Yes. It's a way to you catch a lot of mistakes that way. Yeah. You would not have seen yourself had you not looked at it from somebody else's perspective.
So, to somebody who is going to watch this interview, they'll know that you've been working around here for 20 years or so, and you've done a lot of work, got a lot of recognition for it, you and your firm and your team. Over the course of time, everyone has certain insecurities about their work or about themselves, right? And it's easy to question your own decisions depending on how well it's gone. But while you were going through all these things, did you feel like you knew what you were doing? Did you feel like you knew you were doing the right thing?
Well, certainly from let's call it the mundane or the practical standpoint, we were convinced that we're doing the right thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't propose or we wouldn't have done what we've done. Doesn't mean that there were no doubts on other levels, right? There were, of course, you can doubt yourself very quickly, and it can be disastrous if you start doing it too often or too radically. Doubt yourself on on level of certain design aspects, which very quickly touch upon the philosophical aspects as well. Is this building the right size? Should it not be smaller? But that said, I think you have to have this practical conviction that what you're doing is fundamentally is the right thing for the project. Otherwise, you'll just never get to take any decision. If you let go of that conviction, just the entire card house falls down.
Yeah.
And so,
but do you think that applies to life decisions as well? Because I feel like that's the one aspect that anyone may have doubts about is, did they take the right decision? In your case, perhaps it would be now everything may have worked out, but when someone moves from one country to another or one city to another, or they change their careers entirely, right? You don't always know you have taken the right decision.
No.
So, but when you made your big moves, did you feel like you knew exactly what you were in for?
I think I felt right about it in the moment or in that time span.
Yeah.
But I certainly did not know what I was getting into from a longer, perspective, more into the future. When I moved to India, I did not know what I would be getting into for the next 5 years, right?
Yeah.
But I felt very comfortable with it for the next 2-3 months, and from there it grew, right? So there is a continuity that way of feeling right about decisions, and that applies to design as well. I think it can sound sort of pretentious when you say, I know what's good for this project, but it's actually not. Somebody has to take that up. Somebody has to take it on their shoulders to say that we are doing this. If this is your targeted outcome, let's say we designed a crematorium, and I find that's a pretty big task to decide how that should look for people who will be using it in very sad times of their lives. To decide what that environment should look like seems to me a massive task. But somebody has to take it on and say, let's work on it. And when we do our best, then we therefore know that we're doing the right thing. Yeah. And if the public thinks it's bad or it's not successful, then we will see other crematoria propping up, which will look drastically different or better or solve the problem in different ways. And I think then you have a professional culture, right? Once that happens, then you have peers, like you said, who will develop their take on it, and you will then be able to have public debate about it. Yeah. And then the newspaper can report that this works well or doesn't work so well, and I think that's a good feedback. Criticism, constructive criticism for the profession at large, not just for one architect, for everybody to read. Yeah.
And I think it's a good note to end the conversation when we're talking about you need to have confidence in your own decisions, and also you need to be humble enough to listen to what other people have to say, and then see how you can improve your own way of going about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one needs to be interested in what others are doing or would be doing in a similar situation. And I think that is essentially how culture happens. Yeah. When we do our daily tasks, it doesn't feel like we're creating culture. Yeah. And we certainly don't pretend to be the great creators in that way. But all these small decisions from every day add up in the end to another little built piece of our public culture. It becomes visual. You can see it, I can see it, we can use it, and then it's there. And I think that's part of the beauty of our job.
Thank you very much for talking with me. I've really enjoyed it. I think for me as well to talk about a lot of concepts has been pretty nice, and I'm sure that someone who watches this will have a lot to gain from it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, that's our show for this week. You can find links to get in touch with my guests in the episode description below on YouTube, or if you're listening to the audio podcast, just swipe or tap over the cover art. You can watch other full episodes and curated playlists at everythingcomestogether.com. Please subscribe to Sreenag Pictures on YouTube, or you can listen to the audio podcast by subscribing to Everything Comes Together on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and leave a 5-star review. If you like this episode, please tell a friend about it and help get the word out about this show. The music for this podcast was composed by Aashray Harishankar from Escapist Music, post-production by Thiruvikraman Srinivasaraghavan, and production assistance by Abdul Jeelani. Until we meet again with another fascinating guest, you can reach me on Instagram @Sreenag or at everythingcomestogether.com. Have a good day.